Captain Marvel and She-Hulk, to put it mildly, are not the most popular and beloved characters among the fanbase, and one of the most common complaints that you see when it comes to these two characters is how unlikable their personalities are. But if that was the main problem, then these three should be the most despised characters in their fanbase, and yet they are some of the most beloved and popular characters to exist in their respective genres. So, what is the real problem with these guys? Why are some of them so beloved and others not so much? Well, there are two main reasons for this: lack of acknowledgement and repair, and no extra icing on the cake. So, let's go deep into these 2 points, and finally, we'll be looking at another unlikable character who is very popular to see if these rules and techniques are any good or not. So first off, I don't really think it's a hot take to say that these two characters have some of the biggest haters online. And yes, a huge amount of the hate comes from a very vocal minority, but based on the box office numbers of the Marvels, which is very comparable to The Incredible Hulk, a movie that came out a decade ago, and the fact that She-Hulk is the third lowest viewed series on Disney Plus, it's clear that the average fan doesn't really care about any of these characters either. And yes, the wavering interest in the MCU is another major factor for this performance, but if Guardians 3 proved anything, it's that if you make the audience care about the characters, then they will show up no matter how wavering their trust in the MCU is. So let's go in depth into each main point. The first one is lack of acknowledgement and repair, which is basically whether or not a writer knows if their character's personality is likable or not. And if it's not, then they use some writing techniques, which we will get into in a second, to make sure that these unlikable traits are bearable. But first they need to acknowledge that these characters are unlikable, and the main way they do this is by straight up showing you in an extremely overt way that they are an asshole. So let's take a look at Tony Stark as an example. In the 36 hours ago flashback, you just straight up see him gambling and trying to seduce a bunch of ladies instead of accepting the award that his friend was giving to him, pretty much overtly showing you how selfish and irresponsible he is. And then you have Rhodey very clearly displeased and even goes to yell at Tony for this behavior. Another great example is Rick-Sanchez, who in the first episode of Rick and Morty just pretty much cares only about whether or not Morty can get his mega seeds or not, and he has almost no regard for Morty's well-being and doesn't even care about how much pain his grandson is in, overtly showing you that he is an asshole and only cares about what he wants and how much pleasure he can be in, regardless of how much harm it causes other people. And you straight up get Morty throwing a temper tantrum and giving a proper reaction that you would expect for this kind of behavior. This is basically the writers completely knowing and acknowledging the fact that these characters are complete douchebags, and then they start making these unlikable traits at least a little bearable to watch by the following techniques. But before we get to that, there is one problem I do want to acknowledge in regards to Captain Marvel, which is that you do get her being an asshole, and it's kind of acknowledged in the movie but not completely. It's only partially acknowledged in the story, and this scene in Avengers Endgame perfectly encapsulates my point. Here Carol is really showing her arrogance in an extremely overt way, and to be fair, Rhodey is giving her some crap for it, which is an appropriate reaction, but he gets put in his place almost immediately when she points out that the Avengers failed to protect the Earth, which after we all just went through this is not going to sit well at all. And then a few minutes later you have Thor saying that he likes her, and then she teams up with the Avengers and goes to fight Thanos. So even though the character's negative trait is acknowledged, it's also brushed off only a few minutes later. So all the conflict and character growth this scene offered is just swept under the rug because the movie had a lot of other things to set up. And so the only resolution you get for this conflict is in this scene where they are in holograms and Carol just nods to Rhodey, indicating that they are friends now, except because you didn't see this resolution on screen with proper build-up and development, this moment is not enough to provide you with the catharsis that you need from all the emotions that got stirred up in you because of this scene, and it just feels like there are so many elements missing. One of these elements is that there should be some level of comeuppance that the character gets for their negative traits. A good example of this is Cusco from a Disney movie that's about 23 years old at this point. But you pretty much just have the writers completely hammering home the point that he is an entitled prick and pretty much nobody is standing up to him. They are all completely letting him indulge himself. But towards the later part of the movie, you finally have him getting some comeuppance and suffering for the kind of person he is when he gets turned into a llama or an alpaca. Whatever the difference between these two creatures are, I don't understand them in real life, much less in animation, where you can pretty much have them both look the same. But I digress. We have him being turned into a llama, and he completely loses the cushy lack of touch with reality lifestyle that he has been leading thus far. And you can really see how much he hates that. Which is my first main point. They need to have some level of comeuppance for who they are, whether it is immediately or a little bit later. Again, Rick-Sanchez is a self-indulgent guy who never really gets a proper comeuppance for who he is at the start, but towards the end of the episode, he is forced to move into a nursing home or leave Jerry in charge of the family, which he absolutely despises. This is one of the first techniques the writers use to make an unlikable character bearable to watch. Another really good example is Rexplode from Invincible, who they very overtly show you how unlikable he is, and then you have his teammates rolling their eyes and just straight up saying what a jerk he is. But also they show him being a complete jerk to a little girl who is supposed to be 24, I believe. And he immediately gets his ass handed to him, like she beats him to a pulp. So he immediately gets some comeuppance while Cusco and Rick get one later. The second technique is who these unlikable people are surrounded with, and the main function of this is to make the side characters who this unlikable person is surrounded with. These side characters keep them accountable and make sure that they hold them back from their worst impulses and traits. Tony Stark in the party scene in Iron Man 2 is completely at his worst behavior, and Pepper and Rhodey are the ones who try to get him back to being better. And also Rhodey takes away his Iron Man suits and gives it to the military. All of this is because of his self-destructive behavior. Billy Butcher is a lunatic who will cross any line and do anything heinous if it means he can achieve what he wants. He is also manipulative and kind of a jerk, but he is paired up with Huey, who in so many ways is his moral compass, thus keeping him from going full extreme, although he is still very cruel and heinous. Which brings me to the third technique, which is the introduction of these characters. And there are two main ways that they introduce these unlikable people. First is through the point of view of another character. Rick is introduced to us from Morty's point of view. Butcher is introduced to us from Huey's point of view, and although both of these are co-leads in their respective TV shows, at first we always see them through these two's point of view, and the writers thread along a mystery around these characters and their backstory. Why are they the way they are? And we usually get a very dramatic, emotional backstory, which is gut-wrenching to watch. And you empathize with them and understand why they are the way they are. And that is where I do think they are also going to go with Rexplode in future Invincible seasons. The second one is when you are in the unlikable person's point of view, and the technique they use here is they make you root for him out of lack of options. Tony is not a nice guy, but when your only options come down to him or the Ten Rings or Obadiah, he is a better option, and he is your only option due to the fact that he has an Iron Man suit and is the only one capable of stopping these two. Same with Peacemaker, because they can't tell anybody about these parasites and his father is just the worst, so you root for him just because of lack of options and some sympathy. But there are techniques that they use for these unlikable characters regardless of how they are introduced. One of them is the beating heart dilemma, which is basically the writers showing you that they actually do have a softer side to them. Rick-Sanchez loves and cares about Morty. He might never admit it and try to rationalize it in a logical way of the Morty waves cancelling out the Rick waves. but from a few of his actions, it's clear he does care about Morty. Tony Stark, for all the eccentricity and smugness he shows, you can see that at his core he cares about some people and also wants to do the right thing. It might be because he wants to protect his legacy, but he is going to do the right thing. And the main function here is that it lets you know that at their core they are good people, and this makes you root for them a little bit more, especially when you pair it up with a tragic backstory. Another technique is when the writers either make the unlikable lead go up against or be paired up with someone who shares their heinous traits. And the writers usually make it a point to show you how much your unlikable lead despises those traits when their antagonistic force showcases them. A few examples are Tony and Obadiah. Both are very rich war profiteers who are very selfish and irresponsible. But when Obadiah shows how irresponsible and selfish he is by giving the Ten Rings weapons because he wants to maximize his profit margins and wants to be in control of the whole company, you see Tony just fuming with rage. Rick-Sanchez hates the Council of Ricks because of how shitty they are, and also hates Rick Prime because of how little he cares about anything but himself. And this technique does two things. The unlikable lead hating these repugnant traits in their antagonist makes us feel cathartic for them getting a level of comeuppance, but also brings out a lot of the positive traits to the forefront. Tony might be just as selfish and careless as Obadiah, but at least he takes accountability for his actions and also cares about the lives of other people instead of just maximizing the profit margins. Rick-Sanchez might be every bit as narcissistic as the council, but at least he loves his family and genuinely cares for his grandson and is also somewhat accountable to his actions, although that's mainly thanks to Morty. Also, an optional technique is that these unlikable characters hate their negative traits as much or even more than the audiences. Tony hates how selfish and irresponsible he is. Peacemaker hates the kind of person he is, and also Billy Butcher hates the fact that he is just as abusive and tough nut of a man as his father, which also brings a level of catharsis to the audience and makes them a little bit more relatable. Now we move on to the second main point, but before we do that, let's see if any of these techniques are used when they were writing She-Hulk or Captain Marvel. The first is the people they are surrounded by. Well, in the movie, whoever calls them out for their bad traits are shown in a negative light. Captain Marvel, being an arrogant douche, never gets her any comeuppance, and whenever Rhodey calls her out for these, it's framed as him just overreacting, while Cap and Thor embrace her. Same in her solo movies. Her killing a lot of Skrulls is completely forgiven by Talos, and Maria and her other friends are there to encourage her. As for She-Hulk, you have her being surrounded by these two who also encourage her, and Todd, who I do not like at all, but he does have a fair point that she is very entitled and narcissistic, and he is pretty much framed by the show as a complete loser, which he is, but also his legitimate points are framed as just a hater who hates. So straight away their negative traits are glossed over and don't have any consequences except for the time She-Hulk finally does get angry, which is also completely undone at the end, and she doesn't really change for the better. Because her main lesson is ignore the haters, not I need to listen to more reasonable people or whatever. They also never face somebody who shares their worst traits, because Todd, even though he is a Hulk and also just as entitled and moronic, she doesn't hate him, she just ignores him and considers herself above him and considers herself above these things, which is not cathartic. And for Captain Marvel, she never faces anyone who shares her worst traits. Finally, do they hate themselves? Not really. Any insecurities they had are completely purged when they get their powers, and they are surrounded by people who encourage them. And as for their backstories, we don't really get Captain Marvel ever interacting with her dad, which might justify why she is the way she is. They could easily say that her dad always looked down on her and hated the fact that he had a daughter or something, and This just made him never really value her or even show her any love, which pretty much brings her self-esteem to an all-time low, and her arrogance is a defense mechanism against this. And also her trying to be the best at everything is thanks to her father. We just need to understand why they are the way they are. Same with She-Hulk. We meet her family and they are nothing but supportive of her and love her, which once again skips the idea of finding out why they are the way they are. Now let's move on to the second point, which is extra icing on the cake. This is basically something interesting or fun the character offers to the story and the audience. This is where you get into the good parts of these unlikable characters. Whether it be deeply exploring a theme like Rick allows the writers to deeply explore nihilism in a both positive and negative way, but you can only explore it in a negative way if you are exploring that theme with Captain America or Superman, because them being optimistic and idealistic to the fault is a core part of who they are. And Rick-Sanchez is a deeply broken, dead inside man, so they can explore nihilism and complex moral dilemmas, like Billy Butcher going as far as to mercilessly kill others no matter how innocent or effed up they are in order to stop the Seven is a fascinating moral dilemma, because would you compromise your morals and niceness if it means you can stop absolute pieces of like Homelander? It's definitely worth a discussion, and it's something again you can't really do with Captain America. And you also have the enjoyment factor, like the fact that Tony Stark allows you to experience innovative action sequences like the F-22 air fight sequence, or just really amazing badass moments like when he lands in Golmera and starts taking people out, which at the time you really did not get any action sequences like this. Or even the thrill when you first see him fly, you did not get as much of these things. As for Rick-Sanchez, he allows the writers to explore brand new worlds that you have never seen before. New concepts that you haven't really seen that much of, like the train episode, or going full meta, or just lets you experience chaotically fun adventures. Billy Butcher's inherent meanness allows the writers to go for a really dark sense of humor, and also lets the show completely explore satire humor, which is definitely unique to this show. Now, I will say the writers for these two were completely screwed over by this, because Captain Marvel allows you to go see crazy new worlds and just have spaceship battles, but Guardians of the Galaxy gave you all those new exciting concepts 5 years earlier, and She-Hulk's sitcom aesthetic was completely overshadowed by WandaVision, and this show had a lot of interesting themes and was just more of a fun concept to explore than She-Hulk. So they got completely screwed there, and the fourth wall humor breaks was already done by Deadpool 5 years ago. But the most common element that keeps popping up is the sheer amount of entertainment you get every time these characters are on screen, and I don't really know how to really describe this one. There's just a certain level of swagger and yes, I am a complete tool but I own it energy that these characters just carry themselves with, which just gives them such a magnetic presence, and this presence more than makes up for all the unlikable traits you see that you would normally despise. And one of the things that contributes to this effect is the fact that all these characters have such a distinct personality. Tony's loud bombasticness paired with the complete and utter fun playfulness that Robert Downey Jr. brought to the screen just made him so entertaining to watch. Karl Urban just embodies the full mean, sadistic bastard who loves and enjoys hurting people so well, and the dark sense of humor he has makes him such a great presence on the show. Now, to be fair, the actress who plays She-Hulk does have a great presence, but also the material she's given and the jokes she has on the script are very lazy or just flat out lowbrow humor. Granted, humor is very subjective, but even the funniest jokes and joke types get repetitive when you overuse them. And again, this is another topic that is hard to describe because you have to rely on your personal intuition to know when a joke has just become tiresome, and this show just relies on the break the fourth wall and drop a snarky comment type of joke way too often. at least in my opinion. And as for Captain Marvel, I genuinely think Brie Larson was told by the directors to either look warm and banterful in one scene or just have a stoic and confused, I don't really know how to feel or even what's going on face in other scenes. And to be fair to these directors and the crew who worked on this movie, apparently they had Brie Larson film Endgame first and then come in for Captain Marvel, which is a sure way to get a lot of rewrites. So maybe the writers just didn't have enough time to properly rewrite the script and tell the story they wanted, because they had to have some character consistency with the version we see in her movie and in Endgame. And the last point is incredibly optional, but I think it's also important. What makes this character engaging? And the main factors that I think contribute to a character being engaging is they resonate with you on some level. Spider-Man's a great example of this, because he is always the most optimistic and hopeful guy who constantly keeps getting the worst hand dealt to him. But he perseveres through these atrocities and he never lets his circumstances change him for the worse. Or for you, it could be Captain America, a guy who holds his integrity and morals to the highest level and never compromises on those no matter how bad the situation gets. These are the parts of a character that really resonate with you. And the second one is what makes them interesting to watch. And it could be the complex themes and moral dilemmas a character allows you to explore, or it could just be something that tingles your brain a little bit. For example, Scarlet Witch is a very broken woman who just yearns for love and connection, and this makes her relapse into her worst tendencies, like holding a town hostage because she has a happy life, and also her power to warp reality and just have almost anything she wants only feeds these worst impulses. Or it could be Stephen Strange and how he introduced you to magic, a completely new concept in the MCU, and also comes up with creative ways to stop people like Dormammu. And also he turns the souls of the damned into his cape, which is another great example of his creativity. But in my opinion, the best example for an engaging character is Tony Stark, who is very impulsive and obsessed with being Iron Man because he feels like he has to have more control over things in a world that keeps getting more and more chaotic, which further fuels his addiction of being Iron Man, and he keeps working on new suits all the time. And this behavior pushes Pepper and Rhodey away from him, the two people who were keeping him neutral, healthy, and relatively stable, instead of being impulsive and following his worst tendencies, which is such an interesting place to explore this character from. But also his constant battle with who he wants to be with the kind of person he is something that resonates with a lot of people. Now, as for Captain Marvel and She-Hulk, well, they don't really have that many complex themes or moral dilemmas to explore, which is fine because these characters are new. But also my main problem is with their powers, because when we are introduced to Captain Marvel, she has two major problems in the story, which are her not being able to join the Kree Star Force Command and also her searching for her identity. The first problem, her wanting to join the Star Force Command, can be achieved by her being a really good fighter. But also she has powers that allow her to just blast people, and these powers easily make her more capable than anybody on the team. And her second problem is her identity, and to be fair, she achieves the self-actualization by joining forces with a bunch of friends. But also she is powerful enough to stop planet-destroying missiles on her own and destroy huge galactic spaceships by herself, which performing those kinds of feats are definitely not dragging down your self-esteem, are they? Now, as for She-Hulk, her main problems are how infuriated and powerless she feels every time a creep approaches her, and also her just wanting to be a successful lawyer working in a top-notch law firm. And then she becomes She-Hulk, and now she can pretty much put any creep in his place with almost no effort. But also her getting hired by a new law firm is because of the fact that she is She-Hulk. Granted, they fire her from her first law firm because she is She-Hulk, but she gets into a much bigger and more cushy law firm because she is She-Hulk. My main point is, there is no personal problem that these characters have that they cannot solve by their powers. and this makes them defined by their powers, which is a surefire way to make them more one-dimensional. Now, I have been dunking on these two for quite a while now, so let's talk about some of their positives. First off, every time Brie Larson has to interact with Nick Fury and her best friend Maria, and Maria's daughter, you actually get some really good chemistry from them. And Maria, being a good friend who lost her best friend for 6 years, is just really well done. And she is much better in the Marvels, where she is actually meant to feel like a person, and her reputation in the galaxy and in the eyes of her superfan Miss Marvel, paired with her shortcomings to do a good job, is really compelling. Also, mad props to Brie Larson for still trying her best in terms of her performance when all she's been getting is just hate and put downs from every corner she can see. And I really hope the fans, the reasonable ones, actually give her a second chance. As for She-Hulk, every time she's bouncing lines off Daredevil, and also every time the actress is actually allowed to show authentic emotions, she's really great. Like, it's hard not to feel for her in the courtroom when a guy just says he doesn't like Jen Walters and only likes She-Hulk. And her genuinely having a good time when she is with Daredevil is really great. Unfortunately, majority of the time, all they do is just make her crack jokes which have a lot of anger and pain behind them. Again, this is subjective, but every time you see her cracking a joke, it just feels like there's a hostile undertone and a lot of pent-up aggression, which you really feel thanks to her tone and a dozen of other things you notice subconsciously. Like I said, this is very subjective, and I am curious about what you guys felt when watching her. Like, genuinely, I want to know your thoughts on this in the comments below. So now we have come to the final section of this video, which is me figuring out if these points and techniques actually have some credibility to them, or if they are just complete nonsense. And the example we are going to be looking at is Cher from Clueless, who a lot of people are fans of. In fact, a lot of people actually do like to dress up like her. From this YouTuber to Iggy Azalea in the song Fancy. Also, this was a really popular movie in the 90s. So Cher is an entitled prick who pretty much thinks the world revolves around her and is filthy rich and a spoiled brat. So by all estimates, she doesn't really have a fully likable personality. Now, we don't really see her getting a lot of comeuppance at the start of the movie because she can pretty much pay and talk her way out of anything. And then you have her failing the driver's license test, and she can't talk or pay her way out of this. And she gets completely chewed up and she has been reduced to tears. So she has some comeuppance that comes later. Now, they do have her paired up with Dion, who doesn't really hold her accountable. In fact, she encourages her to go shopping and dress classy and be entitled, which is the same problem we had with She-Hulk and Captain Marvel. But unlike those two, you also have her being paired up with Ty, who brings out her more innocent, fun, caring side. And you also have her being paired up with Josh, who does give her pelters and call her out for being selfish for a fairly long part of the movie. And also, she hates the fact that she might be selfish to the point where she asks Dion and even helps Ty get more comfortable in the new school, all to prove to herself and to Josh that she is not selfish. Also, they have her facing antagonistic forces who share her worst traits, first with Amber, who is equally entitled, but unlike Cher, doesn't really care about Ty or anyone else but herself. Cher hates Amber with a passion, and also a more prominent one is Elton, who is just as popular and entitled as Cher. They are both incredibly high status people in their school, mainly because of who their fathers are, but in this car scene when Elton showcases his entitlement, Cher is disgusted by this and even calls him an entitled snob. And Alica Silverstone brings out a certain level of energy and vibrance to this character that makes her entertaining to watch. Also, another kind of obvious fact that I didn't really mention is all these characters do end up becoming better people towards the end of the movie. Tony is Iron Man, a hero from a weapons manufacturer. Cher is a more selfless person who actually wants to do some good and help other people without any selfishness or status boost that she might get. And she also stops judging people by their looks and status and starts judging them by their character. And finally, as a conclusion, do these techniques and principles make an unlikable character become popular in the audience's eyes? Well, based on this example and the fact that pretty much almost all the writing techniques that I have shown in this video being put to work prove that point to be yes. And there is actual proof that this character is popular. Although I still think I might be missing a few more points. But these are the elements I found when I was doing research for the project. So hope it was helpful. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, subscribe to the channel and hope you have a fantastic day. See ya.